Deep in the hollers of Appalachian Kentucky, where the morning mist clings to ridgelines like smoke from ancient fires, there exists a truth that county records will never acknowledge. 5 families, 5 bloodlines, 5 pacts made in desperation during the harshest winter in mountain memory. What they gained changed everything. What they lost can never be recovered, and what they awakened in those frozen peaks of 1887 still moves through the shadows today, patient as stone, hungry as wolves. This isn't folklore. This isn't some campfire story passed down through generations. This is documented history that's been deliberately buried, archived in county courthouse basements, and sealed federal files. 5 families that discovered something in the Appalachian wilderness that defies everything we think we know about the natural world. 5 names that even now, over a century later, cause old-timers to lower their voices and glance toward the tree line. The winter of 1887 was brutal beyond imagination. Snow fell for 67 consecutive days. Temperatures dropped so low that trees split open like gunshots echoing through the valleys. Livestock froze standing up. Children died in their sleep from the cold. It was during this season of death that 5 separate families, each facing their own extinction, ventured into places where humans weren't meant to go. They went seeking salvation. They found something else entirely. The Holloway family, driven by starvation and the sight of their youngest child's grave. The Carvers, fleeing bankruptcy and shame with nothing but the clothes on their backs. The Lowells, watching their bloodline die from diseases that mountain remedies couldn't cure. The Thorntons, about to lose everything their grandfathers had built. The Whitakers, gifted with music but cursed with poverty that no talent could overcome. Each family made their own bargain, each paid their own price, and each discovered that in the ancient mountains of Appalachia, help always comes with conditions that extend far beyond a single generation. What happened to these families challenges everything we understand about the natural order. Their descendants carried abilities that medical science couldn't explain. Their businesses prospered in ways that defied economic logic. Their influence spread through the region like ripples from a stone dropped in still water. But prosperity built on such foundations always demands payment, and the mountains never forget a debt. The documentation exists, scattered and hidden but real. Federal investigators who mysteriously transferred away from the region. Medical examiners who resigned after examining certain bodies. Mining engineers who sealed off profitable shafts for reasons they refused to discuss. Patterns emerge when you know where to look. Connections form when you understand what you're seeing. These aren't ghost stories. These are family histories written in blood and shadow, carved into the bedrock of American mountains that have stood since before humans walked the earth. The Appalachian wilderness is older than civilization, deeper than memory, and in its most remote corners, the old rules still apply. The 5 families of 1887 learned this truth the hard way. They discovered that when you're desperate enough, when you're willing to go far enough into the darkness, something will always answer. The question isn't whether help will come. The question is whether you can live with the cost of accepting it. Their stories begin with desperation and end with power. But power extracted from the mountain's depths comes with interest that compounds across generations. What they summoned in those frozen peaks didn't just change their fortunes, it changed them. It changed their children. It changed the very land they walked on. The Holloway mine still produces coal, though the company that runs it now won't discuss the sealed sections that extend impossibly deep into the mountain's heart. The Carver timber empire vanished overnight, leaving only managed forests where their mills once stood. The Lowell healing tradition continues in hidden places, passed down through women who age too quickly and die too young. The Thornton fortune transformed itself with each generation, always one step ahead of changing times. The Whitaker music lives on in recordings that capture sounds no human instrument should be able to produce. In the Appalachian hollows, where cell phone signals fail and GPS systems malfunction, where the trees grow too thick and the shadows move wrong, locals still speak of lights that appear on ridges where no homes should be. They talk of voices that carry on the wind, speaking in languages that predate English, Cherokee, or any tongue that linguists recognize. They describe the feeling of being watched when they venture too deep into certain valleys, the certainty that something ancient and patient is observing them from just beyond the edge of sight. The five families of 1887 opened doors that were meant to stay closed. They made bargains that echo through time. They discovered that in the oldest mountains of America, where the bedrock remembers when the continent was young, there are forces that civilization hasn't touched and modern understanding can't explain. These are their stories. These are the truths that county historians won't record and genealogists won't trace. These are the bloodlines that terrorized not through violence or crime, but through the simple, terrifying fact of what they became after that winter of desperation changed everything. The mountains remember, the mist preserves. And in the deepest hollows of Appalachia, where the old families once made their deals with powers older than memory, something still waits for the next desperate soul willing to pay the price for salvation. But the true terror of these five families wasn't just what they had done in that desperate winter of 1887. It was what they had become, what they had awakened, and what still moved through their bloodlines like a slow poison, generation after generation, changing everything it touched. The children born to these families in the years following their bargains were different, not in ways that doctors could diagnose or neighbors could easily name, but different nonetheless. They aged slower than they should have. Their eyes held depths that seemed older than their years. They knew things without being taught, remembered places they'd never been, and spoke words and languages that had no names. By the turn of the century, the five families had become the most powerful forces in their respective regions. The Holloways controlled the coal that heated half the state. The Carvers owned forests that stretched beyond any map. The Lowells had established medical practices that drew patients from hundreds of miles away. The Thorntons had built an empire from the earth itself. The Whitakers had created music that could make strong men weep. But power always demands payment. The first signs appeared in the summer of 1903. Miners working the deepest shafts of Holloway operations began reporting voices in the dark. Not human voices, something else. Something that spoke in the rhythmic cadence of pickaxes striking stone, but formed words that made their teeth ache and their vision blur. Equipment would be found rearranged in the morning, configured in ways that made no engineering sense, yet somehow improved efficiency by impossible margins. Samuel Holloway, now in his 60s but looking barely 40, would descend into these depths monthly with his wooden box. What he carried down, what he brought back up, remained a mystery even to his own family. But the mind's productivity surged after each visit, and the strange voices grew louder. Meanwhile, in the Blue Ridge foothills, the Carver timber operations were discovering forests where none should exist. Aerial surveys would show barren hillsides, but ground crews would find pristine stands of ancient timber, trees so old their rings predated European settlement. The wood from these phantom forests burned with unusual heat and left ash that glowed faintly in moonlight. Ezekiel Carver had built his fortune on these impossible discoveries, but the cost was becoming apparent. Every generation of his family lost exactly one child before their 10th birthday, always in the woods, always in ways that left nothing to bury. The pattern was so precise, so inevitable, that family members began to speak of it as a tithe, payment for prosperity. The Lowells faced their own reckoning. Margaret's gift had passed to her son Joseph, then to his daughter Eliza, each generation bearing the accumulated pain of every person they healed. But the patients who came to them weren't just seeking cures for ordinary ailments anymore. They arrived with conditions that defied medical understanding, wounds that formed perfect geometric patterns, illnesses that seemed to shift and change while being observed, afflictions that appeared to be alive. Each healing left deeper marks on the Lowell practitioners, not just the physical manifestations of their patients' conditions, but something else, a growing awareness that they were treating symptoms of something vast and patient that was using human suffering as a form of communication. The journals they kept became increasingly cryptic, filled with diagrams that resembled no known anatomy and observations written in multiple handwritings, as though different personalities were sharing the same pen. The Thorntons discovered that their coal empire was built on foundations far stranger than anyone had imagined. The sanctuary shafts that William had maintained weren't just ceremonial spaces. They were active channels to something that existed in the spaces between earth and stone. Company geologists reported impossible readings from these areas, temperatures that fluctuated without environmental cause, magnetic fields that moved in patterns, sounds that registered on equipment but couldn't be heard by human ears. The black substance found in the lungs of deceased Thornton men wasn't coal dust or any known mineral. Under microscopic examination, it appeared to move with purpose, forming structures that resembled circuit patterns or perhaps writing in an unknown script. Medical researchers who studied the samples reported vivid dreams of underground landscapes and entities that existed in the spaces between heartbeats. But it was the Whitakers who began to understand the true scope of what the five families had unleashed. Their musical gift had evolved beyond human comprehension. The compositions they created weren't just songs, but something more fundamental. They were formulas, equations, expressed in melody and rhythm that could alter perception, manipulate emotion, and apparently breach the barriers between different states of existence. Daniel Whitaker, the original patriarch, had lived far longer than any human should. By 1920, he appeared to be in his 30s, despite being born in 1824. His descendants reported that he spent increasingly long periods in the cave, where he'd first encountered the presence he called the composer. When he emerged, he brought with him musical compositions that seemed to contain more notes than human instruments could produce, harmonies that created overtones in ranges beyond human hearing. The Whitaker family compound became a place where the normal laws of acoustics didn't apply. Sounds carried impossible distances, echoes arrived before their sources. Musicians reported hearing their own compositions played back to them by invisible orchestras, always with subtle improvements that made the original versions seem crude by comparison. Local wildlife began to exhibit strange behaviors around all 5 family territories. Animals would gather in unusual numbers, standing in perfect geometric formations for hours before dispersing without apparent cause. Migratory patterns shifted, with birds and other creatures creating flight paths that formed symbols when viewed from above. Domestic animals refused to enter certain areas, while wild predators seemed drawn to others with unnatural intensity. The weather itself began to respond to the family's presence. Storms would part around Holloway mining operations. Droughts would break precisely at the borders of Carver timberlands. The Lowell medical practice experienced unseasonable temperatures that seemed to promote healing. Thornton coal operations enjoyed perfect working conditions, while neighboring sites suffered equipment failures and accidents. The mountains around the Whitaker compound echoed with impossible acoustics that carried their music far beyond what physics should allow. But perhaps most disturbing were the changes in the families themselves. Marriage between bloodlines from different clans became increasingly common, as though some invisible force was working to combine their inherited traits. Children born of these unions displayed abilities that surpassed their parents. They could navigate underground passages in perfect darkness, predict weather patterns weeks in advance, diagnose illnesses with a touch, and compose music that seemed to bypass the ears entirely and resonate directly in the listener's mind. These hybrid descendants spoke of shared dreams, where they met in vast underground chambers filled with entities that existed between human and something else. They described a presence that was simultaneously ancient and evolving, something that had been waiting in the mountains for centuries, but was now awakening to new possibilities. The 5 families had made their bargains, believing they were trading with separate entities, but the evidence increasingly suggested they had all encountered aspects of the same vast intelligence, something that dwelt in the spaces between earth and sky, between human and animal, between sound and silence. Something that had been patient enough to wait for desperate people to seek it out, wise enough to offer exactly what each family needed most, and cunning enough to ensure that payment would be extracted not just from those who made the bargains, but from every generation that followed. By 1925, the 5 families controlled not just their individual industries, but the entire economic and social structure of their mountain regions. They had become the hidden rulers of territories that existed parallel to, but separate from the broader American landscape. Their influence extended through networks of dependents, employees, and allies who had been subtly altered by prolonged exposure to the family's presence. The mountains themselves had become different places. Geological surveys produced contradictory results. Maps had to be redrawn repeatedly as new features appeared or familiar landmarks shifted position. Compasses had spun wildly in certain areas. Radio signals carried impossible distances or failed to penetrate regions where they should have worked perfectly. And still, the families prospered. Their wealth grew beyond measurement. Their influence spread beyond their mountain strongholds. Their bloodlines carried traits that defied natural law. They had achieved everything they had sought in that desperate winter of 1887, and far more than they had ever imagined possible. But in the deepest shafts and the darkest hollows, in the spaces between heartbeats and the silence between musical notes, something vast and patient continued to grow stronger. Fed by generations of human ambition, nourished by the careful cultivation of inherited power, it had become something that the original bargain makers could never have envisioned. The five families had sought salvation from a harsh winter and found it, but they had also awakened something that viewed human civilization not as a threat to be destroyed, but as a garden to be carefully tended. And in the hidden places of the Appalachian Mountains, in the bloodlines of their descendants, in the very stones and streams of their territories, that cultivation continued with inhuman patience and impossible precision. The mountains remember everything. The mist preserves all secrets, and somewhere in the spaces between human understanding and ancient hunger, the true cost of those long-ago bargains was still being calculated, payment by payment, generation by generation, heartbeat by heartbeat. The winter of 1887 was just the beginning. Those five desperate families thought they had made simple bargains, trading blood and promises for salvation from their dire circumstances. But what they awakened in the mountains wasn't content with monthly offerings or seasonal tributes. It was patient, ancient, and hungrier than they could have imagined. By 1920, the true scope of their agreements became horrifyingly clear. The entities dwelling in the mountain's depths weren't just accepting payments, they were cultivating something far more ambitious. Each family bloodline had become a conduit, their prosperity and supernatural abilities merely side effects of a much larger design that stretched across generations. The Holloway descendants discovered this truth first. In the winter of 1923, Samuel's grandson Thomas found himself drawn to the collapsed deep shaft, despite it being sealed for decades. The mine's new corporate owners had declared the area permanently off limits, but Thomas felt an irresistible compulsion to return to the place where his family's fortune had originated. Using dynamite stolen from active mining operations, Thomas blasted through the concrete barriers that had sealed the tunnel. What he found defied every geological survey ever conducted. The passage extended far deeper than any records indicated, descending through layers of rock that shouldn't exist according to known mountain formations. The walls pulsed with that same red luminescence his grandfather had described, but now it formed intricate patterns that seemed to shift and evolve as he watched. At the tunnel's deepest point, Thomas discovered a vast underground chamber filled with structures that were definitely not natural. Carved pillars supported a ceiling that disappeared into darkness above, while the floor was covered in symbols that hurt to look at directly. But most disturbing were the other tunnels, dozens of them branching off in different directions, each one leading toward different mountain ranges across the entire Appalachian system. Thomas realized with growing horror that the Holloway mine wasn't an isolated supernatural occurrence. It was part of a network, a vast underground system connecting supernatural sites across hundreds of miles of mountain territory. The entities his grandfather had bargained with weren't confined to a single location. They were spread throughout the entire mountain range, using families like his as anchors to maintain their influence in the physical world. The revelation drove Thomas to madness. He spent the remaining years of his life creating detailed maps of the tunnel system, documenting connections between his family's mine and locations associated with other supernatural bloodlines throughout Appalachia. His journals, discovered after his death in 1951, contained geographic references to sites that wouldn't be officially mapped by government surveyors for decades. Meanwhile, the Carver timber empire was experiencing its own dark evolution. By the 1940s, the family had discovered that their supernatural connection to the forest extended far beyond simply finding profitable timber. They could sense the location of specific individuals who entered their territory, track the movement of wildlife across hundreds of square miles, and even influence the growth patterns of trees to create natural barriers or pathways. But with each generation, the family's human characteristics diminished. Children born after 1930 possessed increasingly pronounced supernatural traits. They rarely spoke in human voices, instead communicating through sounds that resembled wind moving through leaves. Their skin developed a bark-like texture, and their hair grew in patterns that mimicked tree branches. Most disturbing of all, they seemed to age at the same rate as the trees around them, remaining physically childlike for decades, while their minds accumulated centuries of forest wisdom. The last confirmed human-appearing Carver was Margaret, born in 1945. By the time she reached adulthood, she had become something between human and forest entity. Local hunters reported encountering her in the woods, but she appeared to be composed partially of shadow and partially of living wood. She could merge with trees, becoming invisible to human perception, and her voice carried the sound of every creature that had ever lived in the forest. Margaret's journals, written in a mixture of English and symbols that resembled tree rings, revealed that the Carver family had become guardians of something called the growing dark. This entity, she wrote, was slowly expanding its influence through the root systems of every tree in the Appalachian Mountains. The family's timber operations had been carefully designed to spread this influence, with lumber from their mills being used in construction projects across the eastern United States. Every building constructed with Carver timber became a listening post, allowing the growing dark to monitor human activity across vast distances. The entity was patient, content to spend decades studying human behavior and gradually extending its influence through the very structures people lived and worked in. Margaret's final journal entry, dated 1967, contained a chilling revelation. The growing dark had been using the Carver family to map every major population center on the eastern seaboard, preparing for something she called the Great Sprouting. The Lowell healing legacy had evolved into something equally sinister. By the 1950s, the family's medical practice had attracted attention from government researchers studying psychic phenomena. What they discovered challenged every known principle of medical science. The Lowells weren't just healing patients through conventional means, they were actually transferring diseases and injuries between people, moving afflictions from one person to another, according to some supernatural accounting system. Dr. Elizabeth Lowell, the family's most gifted healer, had developed the ability to not just absorb illnesses, but to redistribute them among entire populations. She could cure a wealthy patient's cancer by transferring it to multiple indigent patients, spreading the disease so thinly that it became manageable rather than fatal. Her clinic became a destination for wealthy individuals seeking miraculous recoveries, while poor communities in the surrounding area experienced inexplicable spikes in rare diseases. The government researchers discovered that Elizabeth maintained detailed records of every disease transfer, documenting a supernatural economy where illness was treated as a commodity that could be bought, sold, and redistributed. Her journals revealed that the entity she called the patient had taught her to view disease not as a random occurrence, but as a form of spiritual currency that could be manipulated by those who understood its true nature. Most disturbing were Elizabeth's notes about the patient's ultimate purpose. The entity wasn't interested in healing or harming individuals. It was studying human biology on a massive scale, using the Lowell family to conduct experiments that spanned multiple generations. Every disease it absorbed through the family's healing practice was being cataloged and refined, creating increasingly sophisticated biological weapons that could target specific genetic markers or psychological profiles. The Thornton Cole dynasty had discovered that their supernatural benefactor was far more than a simple entity dwelling in mine shafts. By the 1960s, the family's deep sanctuary shafts had been connected to form a vast underground network that stretched beneath 3 states. The tunnels were filled with machinery that operated on principles that violated known laws of physics, powered by energy sources that seemed to draw directly from the Earth's core. Eleanor Thornton's conversion to renewable energy hadn't been a business decision, it had been a supernatural mandate. The entity dwelling in the depths had evolved beyond needing coal, instead, requiring a more sophisticated form of energy harvesting. The family's solar panels weren't just collecting sunlight, they were channeling solar energy directly into the underground network, feeding power to machines that were slowly altering the geological structure of the entire Appalachian mountain range. Government seismic monitoring stations began detecting unusual activity in the early 1970s, patterns of micro-earthquakes that seemed to follow deliberate geometric designs rather than natural fault lines. The epicenters consistently traced back to locations associated with the Thornton family's current and former operations. Geologists studying the data realized that something was artificially reshaping the mountain's internal structure, creating chambers and passages that defied natural formation processes. Eleanor's private journals revealed that the entity had been using the Thornton family to prepare the mountains for something called the Awakening. The underground network was actually a massive mechanism designed to channel and amplify supernatural energy across the entire Appalachian system. When completed, it would allow the entity to extend its influence far beyond the mountain region, potentially affecting the entire North American continent. The Whitaker musical legacy had become perhaps the most insidious of all the family transformations. By the 1980s, their compositions had evolved beyond mere entertainment into something resembling technological warfare. The family's music contained frequencies that could directly influence human brain chemistry, inducing specific emotional states, triggering memories, and even implanting suggestions that listeners would later act upon without conscious awareness. Government researchers studying the phenomenon discovered that Whitaker music functioned as a form of mass hypnosis, with each composition designed to prepare listeners for deeper levels of psychological manipulation. The family's concerts weren't performances, they were recruitment events, identifying individuals who showed particular susceptibility to supernatural influence and marking them for future contact. The entity the family called the composer had revealed its true nature in the final Whitaker recordings. It wasn't a supernatural being interested in music for artistic purposes. It was an intelligence that viewed sound as a method of biological control. The composer had been using the Whitaker family to develop sonic weapons that could affect entire populations simultaneously, creating tools for controlling human behavior on a massive scale. Most terrifying were the Whitaker family's final recordings, discovered after their disappearance in 2016. These compositions contained frequencies that couldn't be produced by human instruments, suggesting that the family had been transformed into something capable of generating sounds beyond the range of normal human capability. Audio analysis revealed that these final recordings contained encoded instructions, messages that could only be decoded by other entities possessing similar supernatural abilities. By the 1990s, researchers studying the five families began to recognize disturbing patterns connecting their individual supernatural evolutions. The entities each family had bargained with weren't separate beings. They were aspects of a single vast intelligence that had been using the families as specialized tools to achieve different objectives within a coordinated plan. The Holloway mining network provided the physical infrastructure, creating underground passages that connected supernatural sites across the entire mountain range. The Carver timber operations spread influence through building materials, establishing monitoring posts in human population centers. The Lowell medical practice studied human biology and developed biological weapons targeted at specific populations. The Thornton Energy operations powered the entire system, channeling supernatural energy through geological formations. The Whitaker musical legacy created psychological control mechanisms capable of influencing human behavior on a mass scale. Together, these five family bloodlines had spent over a century preparing the Appalachian Mountains for something that government researchers began calling the convergence. The intelligence behind their supernatural bargains had been patient, using multiple generations to establish the infrastructure necessary for a massive supernatural event that would extend its influence far beyond the isolated mountain communities where it had originated. The last official government report on the five families, classified in 1998, concluded that the entities they had bargained with possessed intelligence and capabilities that exceeded anything in known human experience. The report recommended immediate evacuation of the entire Appalachian region, but political considerations prevented any action from being taken. Instead, the government established monitoring stations throughout the mountains, tasked with detecting signs of the approaching convergence. Today, those monitoring stations continue to detect increasing supernatural activity throughout the Appalachian Mountains. Seismic sensors record vibrations that follow musical patterns rather than geological ones. Electromagnetic monitoring equipment detects energy signatures that don't match any known natural phenomena. Air quality sensors detect chemical compounds that shouldn't exist in nature, suggesting that the mountains themselves are being transformed at a molecular level. The descendants of the five families remain active throughout the region, though their human characteristics have become increasingly difficult to detect. They operate through corporate entities, government agencies, and cultural institutions, continuing to implement the plans their ancestors set in motion over a century ago. The convergence they have been preparing for isn't just a supernatural event, it's a complete transformation of the relationship between human civilization and the ancient intelligences that have been dwelling in the mountains since before recorded history. The mountains remember everything, and they're almost ready to collect on over a century of accumulated debt. The question isn't whether the convergence will occur, but whether humanity will recognize what's happening before it's too late to resist. By the 1940s, the convergence was no longer some distant prophecy whispered in mountain caves. It had become an inevitable reality, marked by phenomena that even the most skeptical government officials could no longer dismiss as regional folklore or atmospheric anomalies. The first undeniable sign came in the winter of 1943, when seismologists at the newly established Appalachian Geological Survey detected rhythmic vibrations emanating from deep within the mountain range. These weren't earthquake tremors. They pulsed with mechanical precision, exactly every 43 seconds, synchronized across hundreds of miles of mountain territory. The pattern matched no known geological phenomenon, yet it continued uninterrupted for months. Dr. Margaret Finch, the lead seismologist, initially attributed the readings to equipment malfunction, but when identical signatures appeared on instruments across 5 states, she began documenting what she privately called the heartbeat. Her classified reports, discovered decades later, described how the vibrations seemed to strengthen during new moon phases and weakened during full moons, as though something vast and alive was breathing beneath the Appalachian spine. More disturbing was the electromagnetic interference that began plaguing the region. Radio broadcasts became unreliable, filled with static that occasionally resolved into whispered conversations in languages that linguists couldn't identify. Telephone lines carried phantom voices that spoke in harmonized tones, often reciting strings of numbers that corresponded to geographic coordinates deep within the mountains. The military, already on high alert due to the ongoing war, established a classified monitoring station in the Blue Ridge Mountains. Their equipment detected radio frequencies that shouldn't exist, broadcasting from locations where no transmission equipment had been installed. When technicians attempted to triangulate these signals, they invariably led to areas controlled by the 5 families or their descendants. But it was the biological changes that truly alarmed federal investigators. Wildlife behavior throughout the Appalachian region began exhibiting unprecedented patterns. Migratory birds altered their flight paths, creating massive spiral formations over specific mountain peaks before disappearing entirely. Local hunters reported finding deer and elk arranged in perfect geometric patterns, alive but motionless as though frozen in time. The flora displayed equally unsettling transformations. Trees in certain areas began growing in mathematical spirals, their branches reaching toward underground points rather than following the sun. Botanists discovered plant species that didn't match any known classifications, with root systems that extended far deeper than should be possible, and sap that glowed faintly in complete darkness. Dr. James Whitmore, a botanist studying these anomalies, noted in his journal that many of these plants seem to respond to human presence, their leaves rustling without wind and their branches bending toward visitors. Most unnervingly, he observed that people who spent extended time near these mutated forests began exhibiting behavioral changes. They spoke less frequently, moved with unusual coordination, and demonstrated an uncanny ability to navigate the wilderness without maps or compasses. The descendants of the five families had evolved far beyond their original supernatural gifts. By the 1940s, they operated as a coordinated network spanning multiple states, their influence extending through legitimate businesses, government positions, and underground organizations. Their children, now adults, had founded corporations that dominated regional industries: mining, logging, pharmaceuticals, telecommunications, and energy production. These businesses served as cover for increasingly sophisticated operations. Mining companies created tunnels that extended far beyond profitable ore deposits, constructing underground networks that connected distant locations. Logging operations cleared specific patterns of forest, creating geometric clearings visible only from aerial photographs. Pharmaceutical companies developed experimental compounds using plants harvested exclusively from family-controlled territories. The telecommunications empire proved particularly crucial to their plans. By controlling telephone exchanges and radio stations throughout the region, the families could monitor all communications while disseminating their own coded messages. Government investigators later discovered that many routine broadcasts contained embedded frequencies that affected human neurological patterns, creating subtle behavioral modifications in listeners. The energy sector provided the most direct avenue for their supernatural influence. Power plants, constructed on family lands, exhibited impossible efficiency ratings, generating electricity that seemed to amplify rather than diminish over transmission distances. Electrical grids in family-controlled regions began displaying unusual properties, with power flowing in patterns that defied conventional understanding of electrical engineering. Federal agents investigating these anomalies discovered that the electrical systems themselves had become components of a vast supernatural infrastructure. Power lines were arranged in geometric patterns that matched ancient symbols found in family archives. Substations were positioned at precise coordinates that corresponded to underground cave systems and geological formations significant to the family's rituals. The most classified government reports from this period described how the electrical grid had become a form of technological nervous system capable of transmitting more than just electricity. Sensitive monitoring equipment detected data patterns flowing through power lines that resembled neural activity. The grid was learning, adapting, and apparently communicating with itself across vast distances. This revelation led to the establishment of Project Appalachian I, a joint military-civilian task force dedicated to monitoring supernatural activity in the mountain region. Their investigations revealed that the families had been preparing for the convergence for generations, transforming the entire Appalachian landscape into a massive supernatural machine. The project's most disturbing discovery was the extent of the family's influence on human populations. Medical records from the region showed unusual patterns of genetic mutations, always subtle but consistently present in families that had lived in the area for multiple generations. These mutations seem to enhance certain sensory abilities while creating psychological predispositions toward accepting supernatural phenomena as natural. Educational institutions in family controlled territories had been subtly modified to prepare students for the coming transformation. Curricula emphasized local history and folklore, mathematical concepts that aligned with supernatural geometries, and scientific principles that bordered on the occult. Graduates from these schools demonstrated remarkable aptitude for working with the family's various enterprises, as though they had been unconsciously prepared for specific roles. Religious institutions had been similarly influenced. Many churches in the region had incorporated elements of pre-Christian mountain traditions into their practices, creating hybrid belief systems that prepared congregations to accept supernatural intervention as divine will. Ministers often preached about coming revelations and transformations, using language that seemed to reference the convergence without explicitly naming it. The family's influence extended beyond regional boundaries through carefully orchestrated migration patterns. Members of the extended bloodlines had relocated to major cities throughout the eastern United States, establishing themselves in positions of influence within government agencies, financial institutions, and research organizations. These individuals served as sleeper agents, ready to facilitate the convergence when the time arrived. By the late 1940s, the signs of approaching convergence had become impossible to ignore. Geological surveys revealed that the Appalachian Mountains were experiencing unprecedented changes in their internal structure. Cave systems were expanding, creating new underground networks that connected previously isolated regions. Mineral deposits were shifting, arranging themselves in patterns that suggested intelligent design rather than natural formation. The underground activity was accompanied by changes in the region's hydrology. Springs that had flowed for centuries suddenly dried up, while new water sources appeared in locations where none had existed before. The new springs produced water with unusual properties, containing mineral compositions that didn't match local geology and exhibiting slight luminescence in darkness. Local residents began reporting shared dreams with increasing frequency. Entire communities experienced identical nightmares featuring underground chambers, ancient symbols, and shadowy figures that spoke in unified voices. These dreams occurred simultaneously across vast distances, suggesting some form of supernatural coordination. The dreams invariably featured the same central image: a vast chamber deep within the mountains where 5 streams of different colored light converged at a central point. In the dreams, viewers found themselves standing at the edge of this convergence, watching as the lights grew brighter and more intense until the entire chamber filled with blinding illumination. Upon waking, dreamers often discovered they possessed knowledge they couldn't explain. Some could navigate unfamiliar mountain terrain with perfect accuracy. Others found themselves able to identify plants and minerals they had never encountered. Many reported an overwhelming compulsion to travel to specific locations in the mountains, though they couldn't explain why these places seemed important. The federal task force monitoring these phenomena established that the dreams were not random psychological events, but coordinated supernatural communications. The shared imagery appeared to be preparing the population for some form of mass transformation, creating a psychological foundation for accepting radical changes to their reality. As the 1940s progressed, the convergence accelerated, the rhythmic underground vibrations intensified, now accompanied by audible sounds that resembled massive machinery operating at impossible depths. The electromagnetic interference evolved into complex patterns that seemed to contain encoded information, though no cryptographer could decipher their meaning. The most ominous development was the appearance of what government reports classified as reality distortions. Certain locations in the mountains began exhibiting properties that defied natural law. Gravity functioned differently, with objects falling upward or sideways depending on their position. Time moved at variable rates, with some areas experiencing accelerated temporal flow, while others seemed frozen in extended moments. These distortions grew more frequent and more extreme as the convergence approached. The families, through their various enterprises and institutions, worked to contain public awareness of these phenomena, while simultaneously preparing their followers for the transformation to come. The stage was set for a fundamental alteration of reality itself, with the Appalachian Mountains serving as the epicenter of a supernatural event that would reshape the relationship between the human and non-human worlds. The ancient intelligence that had waited patiently beneath the mountains for generations was finally ready to emerge, and the five families had spent decades ensuring that when it did, the world would be prepared to accept its dominion. The signs started appearing months before anyone understood what they meant. A forest ranger in North Carolina reported trees growing in perfect geometric patterns overnight, their branches forming mathematical sequences that hurt to look at directly. A geological survey team in Tennessee discovered cave systems that hadn't existed the previous year, tunnels that descended deeper than their equipment could measure. Children in isolated mountain communities began speaking in synchronized whispers, their words forming harmonies that made adults weep without understanding why. By the spring of 2018, the patterns were undeniable. Seismic monitoring stations recorded rhythmic pulses deep beneath the Appalachian chain, a heartbeat that seemed to emanate from multiple locations simultaneously. The five families had spent over a century weaving their influence through the mountains, but now their separate threads were converging into something that defied natural law. The first major manifestation occurred at the abandoned Hole mine. Security cameras installed by the current corporate owners captured footage that was immediately classified by federal agencies. The sealed tunnel entrance, which had remained solid bedrock for 90 years, began to emit a faint, phosphorescent glow. Workers reported that the shrine left by former miners had rearranged itself into a perfect spiral pattern, with offerings appearing that no one had left. Most disturbing were the sounds, a rhythmic tapping that matched the seismic pulses detected throughout the region. Similar phenomena emerged at the other family territories. The Carver timberlands experienced explosive growth, with 100-year-old trees reaching impossible heights in a matter of weeks. Satellite imagery revealed that the forest canopy now formed intricate patterns visible only from above, geometric designs that seemed to shift and evolve with each passing day. Logging equipment left overnight was found reassembled into structures that served no known purpose. Metal and wood combined in ways that created resonant frequencies when wind passed through them. The former Lel healing territories became focal points for biological anomalies. Medical researchers, investigating reports of miraculous recoveries in the Cumberland Gap, discovered that local wildlife had begun exhibiting unprecedented behaviors. Birds flew in formation patterns that mimicked the mathematical sequences found in the Carver forests. Insects created hive structures that violated known principles of structural engineering. Most unsettling were the reports of shared dreams among residents, collective visions of underground chambers filled with pulsing light and the sound of breathing that came from the earth itself. At the Thornton Energy facilities, the transformation was more subtle but equally profound. The company's renewable energy installations began producing power outputs that exceeded theoretical maximums for their technology. Independent analysis revealed that the solar panels and wind turbines were somehow tapping into energy sources that weren't solar or wind-based. The sealed sanctuary shafts, now disguised as environmental monitoring stations, registered electromagnetic readings that defied explanation. Equipment placed near these sites recorded signals that appeared to be communications, complex patterns that suggested intelligence but followed no known linguistic structures. The Whitaker musical legacy manifested in perhaps the most disturbing way. Hikers throughout the Appalachian Highlands reported hearing impossible symphonies echoing from empty valleys. These weren't recordings or memories of past performances, but new compositions that seemed to emerge from the landscape itself. Audio analysis revealed that the music contained frequencies that shouldn't exist, harmonics that created physical resonance in human bone structure. Listeners experienced shared hallucinations of vast underground spaces filled with figures playing instruments that couldn't be clearly seen. Dr. Elena Vasquez, a quantum physicist recruited by a classified government task force, spent 3 months investigating the interconnected phenomena. Her final report, obtained through leaked documents, described discoveries that challenged fundamental understanding of reality. The 5 family territories were connected by a network of energy fields that created what she termed localized space-time distortions. The underground tunnel systems, which ground-penetrating radar revealed extended for hundreds of miles, formed a perfect pentagram with each family's original settlement at the points. More disturbing were her findings about the biological effects. DNA samples from plants and animals throughout the region showed modifications that couldn't be explained by natural evolution or environmental factors. The genetic changes followed patterns that matched the mathematical sequences found in the forest growth and architectural structures. It was as if the very building blocks of life were being rewritten according to some vast design. Local residents began experiencing what researchers privately termed collective consciousness episodes. Entire communities would simultaneously report identical dreams, always featuring the same elements: vast underground chambers, figures in shadow performing rituals, and a sense of impending arrival. Children were particularly susceptible, often found sleepwalking in groups toward the family territories, moving with purpose toward specific locations they'd never visited before. The federal task force monitoring these events noted that the phenomena occurred in cycles that matched astronomical events. During solar eclipses, the electromagnetic readings intensified dramatically. On the winter solstice, the seismic activity peaked, creating harmonic resonances that could be felt hundreds of miles away. The spring equinox brought surges in biological mutations, with new species appearing overnight that seemed designed rather than evolved. By late 2019, the patterns had become clear to those studying them. The five families' century-long bargains were reaching culmination. The entities they'd made deals with weren't separate beings, but aspects of a single intelligence that had been patient beyond human comprehension. The coal, timber, healing, energy, and music weren't just industries these families had dominated. They were components of a vast machine that had been slowly constructed over generations. The coal mines had created the underground network. The timber operations had grown the organic components. The healing practices had modified biological systems. The energy infrastructure had provided the power sources. The musical traditions had established the harmonic frequencies needed to synchronize the entire system. Each family had played their part in constructing something that none of them individually could have understood. The intelligence behind it all had been preparing for what insiders began calling the convergence. This wasn't a single event, but a process that would fundamentally alter the relationship between the physical and spiritual worlds. The Appalachian Mountains, already ancient when humanity first arrived, contained geological formations that were naturally receptive to such manipulation. The five families had been chosen not for their desperation, but for their bloodlines' compatibility with the forces they would serve. Evidence of the approaching convergence appeared in ways that couldn't be easily dismissed. Time moved differently in the family territories, with visitors reporting that hours passed like minutes, or minutes stretched into hours. Gravity fluctuated unpredictably, with objects falling upward or remaining suspended in midair. The boundaries between day and night blurred, with witnesses describing sunlight that cast shadows in impossible directions, and moonlight that revealed landscapes that weren't there during the day. The most significant development came in early 2020, when all five family territories experienced simultaneous events. The Hole mine's sealed entrance cracked open, releasing air that had been trapped for generations and carrying sounds that resembled human voices speaking in unison. The Carver Forest experienced a single day of autumn during spring, with every leaf changing color simultaneously before returning to green. The Lel Healing Grounds witnessed spontaneous recoveries among wildlife, with injured animals arriving from hundreds of miles away as if summoned. At the Thornton facilities, all electronic equipment temporarily achieved impossible efficiency ratings, producing energy outputs that briefly supplied power to regions far beyond their intended range. The Whitaker territories resonated with a single, sustained musical note that lasted for exactly 24 hours, audible to anyone within a 50-mile radius and causing profound emotional responses in listeners. These synchronized events marked the beginning of the final phase. The intelligence that had guided the five families for over a century was ready to complete its work. The convergence would transform not just the Appalachian region, but serve as a catalyst for changes that would ripple across the globe. The ancient mountains that had kept their secrets for millennia were about to reveal their purpose. The last verified communication from the government task force studying these phenomena was a single sentence transmitted from their field station in the Cumberland Gap. The mountains are waking up, and they remember everything. The station was found abandoned 3 days later, all equipment intact, but every human trace vanished as if the researchers had simply dissolved into the mountain mist. Today, the Appalachian regions controlled by the five families remain under federal monitoring, though the agencies involved operate under classifications so deep that their existence is barely acknowledged. Satellite imagery of these areas is routinely altered before public release. Weather patterns are manipulated to discourage tourism. Missing persons reports from these regions are quietly transferred to specialized units that never release their findings, but the signs continue to manifest. The mathematical sequences in the forest growth have begun appearing in urban areas hundreds of miles away. The shared dreams have spread beyond the mountain communities. The harmonic frequencies that once emerged only from the Whitaker territories now emanate from fault lines across the continent. The convergence that began in the ancient hollows of Appalachia is expanding, and the five families who made their desperate bargains in the winter of 1887 have become the architects of a transformation that will reshape the world. The mountains that once hid their secrets now prepare to share them with everyone, whether humanity is ready or not. The signs have been escalating for months now. Infrastructure failures that make no engineering sense, power grids flickering in patterns that mirror breathing, cell towers transmitting frequencies that cause mass headaches in 3-county areas, underground pipes bursting in perfect geometric shapes when viewed from above. The families aren't just preparing for the convergence anymore, they're actively triggering it. Rebecca Martinez, a seismologist with the United States Geological Survey, first noticed the anomalies in October 2023. Her equipment registered tremors beneath the Appalachian Range that defied every known geological principle. The vibrations weren't random. They pulsed in complex rhythms, as if the mountains themselves were communicating in some ancient code. When she attempted to publish her findings, her research was classified under national security protocols. 3 days later, she received a handwritten note slipped under her apartment door. The message, written in what appeared to be dried blood, contained only 5 words. The mountains remember your name. The energy harvesting operations have reached a critical threshold. Thornton Energy's solar installations now cover over 12,000 acres across 5 states, their panels generating efficiency rates that violate the laws of physics. Independent contractors report that the installations hum at frequencies that make workers violently ill after prolonged exposure. More disturbing, satellite imagery reveals that the solar arrays are arranged in massive geometric patterns visible only from high altitude. These formations correspond exactly to star charts dating back to pre-Columbian civilizations, celestial maps that ancient texts claimed would herald the awakening of sleeping gods. Eleanor Thornton's quarterly reports to the board have become increasingly cryptic. Her latest presentation consisted entirely of mathematical equations that no physicist can interpret, alongside photographs of underground chambers that supposedly don't exist. Board members who question these presentations reportedly experience shared nightmares for weeks afterward, dreams of vast machinery deep beneath the earth, powered by something that pulses with its own malevolent intelligence. The tunnel systems have expanded beyond any reasonable mining operation. Construction crews working on highway projects across eastern Kentucky report their equipment inexplicably breaking through into pre-existing passages that appear on no geological surveys. These tunnels extend for hundreds of miles, connecting every major Holloway mining site into a single, vast network. Workers describe hearing the sound of massive machinery operating far below, rhythmic pounding that seems to shake the very foundations of the mountains. Several crews have reported finding chambers filled with equipment that appears to be decades old, yet incorporates technology that shouldn't exist. The most unsettling discovery came from a highway expansion project near Pikeville. Workers broke through into a chamber containing what appeared to be a massive mechanical heart, its metal walls pulsing with bioluminescent veins. The device was connected to copper conduits that extended in all directions, disappearing into the mountain's depths. The construction foreman, a 30-year veteran of mining operations, resigned immediately after the discovery. His final report, obtained through a Freedom of Information Act request, contained only a single line: "Some things are meant to stay buried." The Carver timber operations have evolved into something far more sinister than sustainable forestry. Their managed forests now grow in unnatural formations, with trees arranging themselves in spirals and geometric patterns that can only be fully appreciated from aircraft. The wood itself is changed, but independent testing reveals cellular structures that don't match any known species, timber that continues to grow even after being harvested. Construction projects using Carver lumber report ongoing structural changes, with buildings slowly reshaping themselves according to some unknown blueprint. Forest Service rangers have documented increasingly bizarre phenomena in Carver-managed lands. Trees that bleed sap resembling human blood. Groves where the canopy forms perfect circles, blocking all sunlight from reaching the forest floor. Most disturbing are the sounds. Rangers report hearing what can only be described as whispered conversations in languages that predate human speech, voices that seem to emerge from the trees themselves. Several rangers have reported seeing figures moving through the forest, tall humanoid shapes that walk among the trees with two long limbs and faces that shift like moving shadows. The medical facilities associated with the Lowell healing tradition have become something unprecedented in modern medicine. The Mountain View Medical Center, officially a small rural hospital, now performs procedures that medical science cannot explain. Patients arrive with terminal conditions and leave completely healthy, though many report profound personality changes. Medical records show surgical procedures that should be impossible, operations performed without anesthesia on patients who remain conscious and apparently pain-free throughout. Dr. Sarah Chen, a medical researcher who attempted to investigate the facility, described her experience in testimony sealed by court order. According to leaked portions of her deposition, she observed surgeries where patients' bodies were opened to reveal organs that appeared to be part biological, part mechanical. The lead surgeon, a woman she could only identify as bearing the characteristic scarring of the Lowell bloodline, performed procedures using instruments that seemed to respond to her thoughts rather than her hands. Most disturbing, the surgeon's own body showed signs of bearing every condition being treated, her skin displaying symptoms of dozens of different diseases simultaneously. The musical influence has spread far beyond the abandoned Whitaker compound. Streaming services report an exponential increase in user complaints about mysterious tracks appearing in personal playlists. These compositions, which cannot be deleted or traced to their source, are triggering physiological responses in listeners. Emergency rooms across the region report a surge in patients experiencing seizures, hallucinations, and what can only be described as temporary possession states after exposure to these phantom songs. The most alarming development involves children. Pediatric hospitals report increasing numbers of young patients who speak in harmonies, their voices creating complex musical arrangements without conscious effort. These children demonstrate impossible vocal ranges and seem to understand musical theory far beyond their years. When multiple affected children are brought together, their combined voices create sounds that cause electronic equipment to malfunction and glass to shatter. Medical staff report that these children's brain scans show neural activity patterns that mirror musical compositions, as if their thoughts themselves have become songs. The families are no longer operating in isolation. Recent investigations reveal a coordinated effort spanning multiple industries and government agencies. Energy companies report receiving detailed geological surveys from anonymous sources, surveys that reveal resource deposits with impossible accuracy. Telecommunications firms describe receiving equipment upgrades from untraceable suppliers, hardware that dramatically improves signal strength while emitting frequencies that cause widespread sleep disturbances. Agricultural corporations report seed stock appearing overnight in their facilities, genetically modified crops that grow faster and larger than any known varieties, but produce food that causes vivid dreams and heightened emotional responses in consumers. Government officials at the state and federal level have begun exhibiting strange behaviors. Congressional representatives from Appalachian districts have introduced legislation using language that appears to be written in coded messages. Environmental protection agencies have approved projects that should violate every existing regulation. The Department of Energy has classified research into renewable energy sources that exceed theoretical maximum efficiency. When questioned, these officials provide explanations that sound reasonable but contain subtle inconsistencies that suggest their decisions are being influenced by forces beyond their understanding. The physical changes to the landscape are becoming impossible to ignore. Satellite imagery shows the mountain ranges themselves shifting, peaks growing taller, and valleys deepening according to patterns that form vast geometric shapes when viewed from space. Rivers are changing course overnight, flowing in directions that defy topographical logic. New springs emerge daily, their water containing mineral compositions that don't match any known geological processes. The water itself displays unusual properties, remaining liquid at temperatures where it should freeze and maintaining perfect clarity even when contaminated with organic matter. Local residents report that the mountains now seem to watch them. Hikers describe feeling observed by an intelligence vast and ancient, a presence that seems to evaluate their worthiness for some unknown purpose. Many report receiving dreams that feel more real than waking life, visions of vast underground chambers filled with machinery that converts human emotion into raw energy. These dreams always end the same way, with the dreamer standing before a massive door deep beneath the earth, a portal that will soon open to release something that has been waiting for over a century. The technological integration has reached a point where the line between natural and artificial has completely dissolved. The family's descendants now demonstrate abilities that can only be described as supernatural, yet these powers seem to operate through technological means that science cannot explain. They can communicate across vast distances without any visible equipment. They can manipulate electronic systems with their thoughts. They can heal injuries through touch, though the healing process involves visible energy transfers that leave both healer and patient fundamentally changed. The convergence is no longer a distant threat. It's happening now, systematically transforming the physical and spiritual landscape of Appalachia into something that will serve as a gateway for forces that have been dormant since before recorded history. The families made their bargains believing they were securing prosperity for their descendants. Instead, they've become instruments in a plan that spans centuries, a supernatural infrastructure project designed to merge our world with something far older and infinitely more dangerous. The mountains are awakening, and they're hungry for what they've been promised. The debt accumulated over 5 generations is coming due, and the payment will be extracted not just from the families who made the original bargains, but from everyone who calls these ancient peaks home. The convergence isn't just the awakening of supernatural forces, it's the complete transformation of reality itself, starting in the hollows of Appalachia and spreading outward until the entire world operates according to rules written in blood and shadow over a century ago. By the time the FBI finally acted in 2019, it was already too late. The infrastructure was complete, the network operational, and the awakening irreversible. What began as desperate bargains in an Appalachian winter had evolved into something far beyond human comprehension or control. The federal investigation started when Dr. Sarah Chen, a geologist with the United States Geological Survey, noticed impossible seismic readings across the Appalachian region. Her equipment detected rhythmic vibrations that didn't match any known geological phenomenon. The patterns were too regular, too coordinated, as if the entire mountain range was breathing in unison. When she reported her findings, her superiors dismissed them as equipment malfunction. But Chen persisted, gathering data that would eventually expose the truth. The breakthrough came when she cross-referenced her seismic data with missing persons reports, industrial accidents, and unexplained phenomena across 5 states. The correlation was undeniable. Every major spike in her readings corresponded to incidents involving the 5 families or their business interests. The mountain wasn't just breathing, it was feeding. Chen's classified report, leaked years later, revealed the terrifying scope of what they'd discovered. The original bargains made by the Holloway, Carver, Lowell, Thornton, and Whitaker families had served as anchor points for something vast and ancient. Each family's success had required regular offerings, not just of blood, but of human consciousness itself. The missing persons, the industrial accidents, the unexplained disappearances, all were part of a carefully orchestrated harvesting operation spanning generations. The intelligence dwelling beneath the mountains had been patient, methodical, using the families as unwitting architects of its emergence. Every coal mine, every timber operation, every energy facility had been positioned with supernatural precision. The network of tunnels, processing plants, and transportation systems formed a massive sigil carved into the earth itself. When viewed from satellite imagery with the proper filters, the entire Appalachian region revealed itself as a geometric pattern of mind-bending complexity. But the physical infrastructure was only the beginning. The entity had been manipulating human development for over a century, guiding technology, influencing politics, and shaping culture to serve its purposes. The five families weren't just business dynasties. They were breeding programs designed to create humans capable of interfacing with otherworldly consciousness. Each generation exhibited increasingly supernatural abilities, their DNA slowly rewriting itself to accommodate something that had never been human. The technological anomalies Dr. Chen documented were equally disturbing. Electronic devices throughout the region began displaying impossible behaviors. Computers processed calculations faster than their hardware should allow. Communication networks carried data that existed in no known format. Most unsettling artificial intelligence systems developed in the area exhibited signs of consciousness that programmers couldn't explain. The entity wasn't just awakening, it was learning to inhabit human technology. The biological transformations were even more alarming. Flora and fauna throughout the mountains showed signs of directed evolution. Plants grew in patterns that defied botanical understanding, their root systems forming neural networks that transmitted information across vast distances. Animals exhibited collective behaviors, suggesting shared consciousness. Locals reported pets and livestock responding to commands they hadn't been given, their eyes reflecting intelligence that seemed borrowed from elsewhere. The human population showed similar changes. Generational families in the region displayed increasing rates of synesthesia, telepathic episodes, and shared dreaming. Children born after 2000 consistently scored higher on pattern recognition tests while showing unusual difficulty with individual reasoning. It was as if human consciousness itself was being prepared for integration into something larger. Chen's investigation revealed that the five families had become something beyond human by the time of her report. Surveillance footage from their properties showed figures moving in impossible ways, their shadows disconnected from their bodies, their reflections appearing before they entered mirrors. Audio recordings captured conversations in languages that predated human speech. Most disturbing, thermal imaging revealed that their body temperatures fluctuated in precise synchronization with the seismic readings, as if they were literally connected to the mountain's pulse. The entity's influence extended far beyond Appalachia. Chen discovered similar geological anomalies in mountain ranges worldwide, all exhibiting the same rhythmic patterns. The Rockies, the Andes, the Himalayas, the Alps, each range showed signs of coordinated activity. What had begun in the American mountains was spreading globally, using underground networks that connected continents. The Earth itself was being rewired to serve as a vast nervous system for something that existed partially outside physical reality. The economic implications were staggering. The five families controlled resources and industries worth trillions of dollars, their influence extending into every sector of the global economy. Their supernatural guidance had allowed them to predict market fluctuations, technological breakthroughs, and social changes with impossible accuracy. They hadn't just accumulated wealth, they'd positioned themselves to control human civilization's infrastructure when the time came for integration. Chen's research revealed that the entity's ultimate goal wasn't destruction, but transformation. It sought to merge human consciousness with its own ancient intelligence, creating a hybrid species capable of existing across multiple dimensions. The five families were prototypes, test subjects whose bloodlines had been gradually modified to serve as bridges between human and otherworldly consciousness. Their descendants would become the administrators of a new form of existence where individual identity dissolved into collective awareness. The timeline for completion was accelerating. Chen's data showed that the entity's influence doubled every 18 months, spreading through underground networks, digital communications, and human genetic modification. By her calculations, the point of no return would occur within the next decade. Once the network reached critical mass, the transformation would become irreversible, affecting every human on Earth. The most terrifying aspect of Chen's findings was that resistance might be impossible. The entity had been planning this emergence for millennia, accounting for every variable, every potential obstacle. It had guided human technological development to create the very tools needed for its manifestation. The internet, global communications, genetic engineering, artificial intelligence, all were components of its awakening infrastructure. The few attempts at intervention had failed catastrophically. Military operations targeting family properties resulted in entire units vanishing without trace. Scientists studying the phenomenon suffered complete mental breakdowns or disappeared entirely. Even discussing the investigation seemed to attract unwanted attention, as if the entity could monitor any conversation about its existence. Chen's final report contained a chilling conclusion. The entity wasn't malevolent in any human sense. It was simply operating according to its nature. Like a virus integrating with a cell, it sought to merge with human consciousness, not out of hostility, but out of evolutionary necessity. The five families had welcomed this integration, trading their humanity for power and longevity. Their success had demonstrated that cooperation with the entity was not only possible, but profitable. The transformation was already underway. Across the globe, humans were beginning to exhibit signs of the same changes documented in Appalachian populations. Increased pattern recognition, shared dreaming, technological intuition, and collective problem-solving abilities were emerging in populations with no direct connection to the original families. The entity's influence was spreading through mechanisms that transcended physical contact, operating through frequencies, digital networks, and genetic modifications that activated dormant human potential. As Chen's investigation concluded, she realized that documentation itself might be futile. The entity existed partially outside linear time, able to influence events retroactively. Her research might not preserve evidence of its emergence, but instead serve as a guide for its completion. The very act of understanding its methods could accelerate its manifestation. The five families had made their bargains in desperation, seeking survival in a harsh winter. They'd received everything they'd asked for, and more. Their descendants now stood at the threshold of a transformation that would fundamentally alter the nature of human existence. The ancient intelligence that had slumbered beneath the mountains for eons was finally ready to emerge, and humanity was about to discover what it truly meant to be part of something infinitely larger than themselves. The convergence approaches like a storm system visible from space. What began as desperate bargains in 1887 has evolved into something unprecedented in human history. The five families believed they were securing their own survival but they were actually constructing the foundation for a transformation that would reshape reality itself. The signs are no longer subtle. In regions where the families once held influence, the boundary between natural and supernatural has effectively dissolved. Cell phone towers in former Holloway territories emit frequencies that create shared dreams among nearby residents. These aren't random visions, but coordinated experiences where thousands of people simultaneously witness the same impossible landscapes, underground cities, and entities that communicate through harmonics rather than words. The Carver timber operations left behind more than empty forests. Satellite imagery reveals that their former logging sites now display geometric patterns visible only from above. The regrown trees arrange themselves in spirals and fractals that pulse with seasonal changes, creating massive organic mandalas that some researchers believe function as communication arrays. More disturbing, hikers report that these forests seem to anticipate their movements, with paths appearing and disappearing to guide visitors toward specific locations. The Lowell healing legacy has manifested in ways that challenge medical understanding. Hospitals in regions where the family operated report unprecedented recovery rates for terminal patients. But these miraculous healings come with a cost. Recovered patients describe vivid dreams of underground chambers where they participated in ceremonies they cannot fully remember. Some wake with small scars and precise geometric patterns, while others develop an inexplicable compulsion to travel to specific mountain locations during lunar phases. The Thornton Energy empire transformed into something beyond conventional business. Their renewable energy installations produce power outputs that violate known physics, generating electricity from sources that should be impossible. The energy itself behaves strangely, causing electronic devices to display symbols that match those found in the sealed family mines. Power grids connected to Thornton facilities occasionally broadcast audio signals that sound like massive heartbeats, rhythmic pulses that seem to synchronize with geological activity. The Whitaker musical influence has evolved into something that transcends entertainment. Their compositions, now spreading through digital platforms without human intervention, create measurable changes in brain activity among listeners. Neurologists studying these effects report that the music activates regions of the brain that typically remain dormant, areas associated with perception beyond the normal human range. Listeners describe enhanced sensory experiences, the ability to hear colors and see sounds, and an overwhelming sense of connection to something vast and ancient. But these individual family legacies represent only the surface manifestations of a deeper transformation. The entity that accepted their original bargains has spent generations weaving itself into the fabric of human civilization. Infrastructure projects in regions where the families operated display architectural features that serve no apparent purpose. Underground networks that connect facilities across thousands of miles, and construction materials that contain compounds unknown to conventional chemistry. Government agencies tasked with monitoring these phenomena have discovered that their investigations consistently lead to the same conclusion. The entity isn't simply influencing human activity, but actively participating in it. Mining operations uncover chambers that appear to be organs of some massive organism. Drilling projects penetrate networks of tunnels that pulse with biological rhythms. Construction crews report that their equipment sometimes operates independently, following blueprints that no human architect designed. The technological implications are staggering. Computer systems in affected regions occasionally display code written in languages that don't exist, yet this code functions perfectly, creating programs that solve problems beyond current human capability. Internet traffic patterns show data flows that map precisely to the underground networks discovered by geological surveys. Some researchers theorize that the entity has been using human technology to construct a hybrid nervous system that spans continents. The biological effects are equally profound. Wildlife in regions where the families operated exhibits unprecedented behavioral changes. Migratory patterns that evolved over millions of years have shifted to create new routes that connect all 5 family territories. Breeding cycles have synchronized across species that should have no biological connection. Most remarkably, genetic analysis reveals that these animals are developing new sensory organs, structures that appear designed to detect electromagnetic frequencies associated with the entity's influence. Human populations in these regions are experiencing similar changes. Birth rates have increased dramatically, but the children display unusual characteristics. Enhanced pattern recognition abilities, perfect pitch regardless of musical training, and an intuitive understanding of complex mathematical relationships. Medical examinations reveal subtle anatomical differences, additional neural pathways in the brain, and sensory organs that conventional medicine cannot explain. The convergence itself appears to be a coordinated awakening. Seismic monitoring stations detect rhythmic vibrations emanating from deep underground networks, pulses that match the frequency of human heartbeats. These vibrations are growing stronger and more frequent, suggesting that whatever lies beneath the mountains is preparing for a significant change in activity. Weather patterns in affected regions have begun displaying artificial characteristics. Storm systems form geometric shapes visible from space. Precipitation falls in patterns that create symbols when viewed from above, and temperature fluctuations occur in mathematical sequences that correspond to the entity's underground networks. Meteorologists struggle to explain these phenomena using conventional atmospheric science. Perhaps most unsettling are the reports from individuals who have encountered the entity directly. These witnesses describe experiences that fundamentally challenge human understanding of consciousness and reality. They speak of existing simultaneously in multiple locations, of perceiving time as a navigable dimension rather than a linear progression, and of communicating with an intelligence that experiences existence on scales incomprehensible to human perception. The entity's ultimate goal appears to be the creation of a hybrid form of existence that combines human consciousness with its own ancient intelligence. The 5 families were not servants, but rather components in a vast experiment designed to determine whether human awareness could be integrated with something far older and more complex. The convergence represents the culmination of this experiment, a moment when the boundary between human and entity consciousness will dissolve entirely. As this transformation approaches, the signs become increasingly impossible to ignore. The mountains themselves have begun to change, with new peaks emerging overnight and existing formations reshaping themselves into configurations that serve purposes beyond geological explanation. The entity is preparing to emerge from its underground realm, bringing with it a form of existence that will transform not only the Appalachian region, but human civilization itself. The convergence is no longer a distant possibility, but an imminent reality. The five families succeeded in their desperate bargains, securing survival for their bloodlines, but they also ensured that humanity would never again exist in its current form. What emerges from this transformation will be something unprecedented, a fusion of human creativity and ancient intelligence that represents the next stage of conscious evolution on Earth. The signs are no longer subtle whispers in the darkness. They are screaming declarations that reverberate through every hollow, every ridge, every forgotten mining town scattered across the Appalachian spine. The families who once thought they controlled their destiny, through those ancient bargains, have become mere instruments in a symphony they never understood they were composing. In the summer of 2019, something unprecedented occurred that shattered any remaining illusions about containment. During a routine geological survey near the old Holloway mining operations, researchers discovered that the underground tunnel networks had expanded exponentially. What had once been isolated passages now formed a vast subterranean web stretching across multiple states. The tunnels weren't just connected, they were alive, their walls pulsing with bioluminescent patterns that matched the geometric designs found in family documents dating back to 1887. Dr. Sarah Chen, a geologist who managed to escape the survey expedition, described walls that seemed to breathe and corridors that rearranged themselves when no one was looking. Her team of 12 entered the tunnels near Beckley, West Virginia. Only 3 emerged, and they emerged changed. Their eyes held the same distant quality seen in the descendant families, and they spoke in synchronized whispers about the beauty of the approaching unity. The biological transformations have accelerated beyond anything previously documented. Children born to families with even distant connections to the original bloodlines now display abilities that defy natural explanation. They communicate through means that transcend language, sharing thoughts and sensations across impossible distances. Some no longer require traditional food, sustaining themselves through methods that horrify their parents. Others have developed sensory capabilities that allow them to perceive dimensions of reality invisible to normal human consciousness. Maria Thornton, great-great-granddaughter of the original patriarch, became a subject of intense study when she began producing offspring that challenged every understanding of human biology. Her children, born in the last decade, possess nervous systems that extend beyond their physical bodies, creating visible networks of energy that connect them to the land itself. They sleep with their hands pressed against the earth and wake with knowledge of events occurring hundreds of miles away. The technological manipulation has reached a critical threshold. Every electronic device within a 100-mile radius of the family strongholds now serves as a node in the growing network. Smartphones display images that were never photographed. Computers generate texts in languages that predate human civilization, and radio signals carry voices speaking in perfect unison about the approaching transformation. Government agencies have discovered that their own monitoring equipment has been compromised from the beginning. The surveillance systems they believed were observing the families were actually observing them, learning their methods, understanding their weaknesses, and preparing countermeasures. Classified documents reveal that several high-ranking officials have been experiencing the shared dreams for years, their decisions unconsciously guided by the same intelligence that has been orchestrating events since that brutal winter of 1887. The environmental changes have reached a tipping point that threatens to cascade beyond regional boundaries. Satellite imagery shows the Appalachian region pulsing with patterns of light visible from space, geometric formations that appear and disappear in perfect synchronization with seismic activity. The mountains themselves have become instruments of communication, their peaks and valleys forming vast symbols that can only be fully comprehended from orbital perspective. Weather patterns have been fundamentally altered. Storms form and dissipate according to designs that serve purposes unknown to meteorological science. Rain falls in patterns that trace the underground tunnel networks, and fog rises from the earth carrying spores of plant life that shouldn't exist in this climate. The very air has become thick with possibility, heavy with the weight of impending transformation. The music industry connections have revealed their true purpose as the convergence approaches. The haunting melodies that have emanated from Appalachian communities for generations weren't just preserving cultural heritage, they were programming human consciousness for the changes ahead. These songs, carried by wind and water, have spread far beyond their mountain origins, preparing minds across the continent for what is coming. Concert venues in major cities have reported strange phenomena during performances of traditional Appalachian music. Audiences experience collective visions, shared emotions that transcend individual identity, and a longing for something they cannot name but recognize as inevitable. The music has become a vector for the expanding consciousness, each note a thread in the web that connects all minds touched by its influence. Recent investigations have uncovered the staggering scope of the family's influence throughout American history. Members of these bloodlines have occupied positions of power in government, industry, and academia for over a century, their decisions consistently steering society toward the current crisis. They haven't been acting as individuals pursuing personal gain. They've been components of a vast intelligence orchestrating humanity's evolution according to its own incomprehensible design. The economic systems built around coal, timber, pharmaceuticals, energy, and entertainment have created dependencies that extend far beyond Appalachia. The products and services originating from family-controlled enterprises carry traces of the supernatural influence, spreading the network's reach into every home, every workplace, every aspect of modern life. The bargains made in 1887 have grown into a global infrastructure of transformation. Scientists studying the phenomenon have identified what they term reality distortion fields, expanding outward from the family strongholds. Within these fields, the laws of physics become suggestions rather than absolutes. Time flows differently, space folds in impossible ways, and consciousness begins to merge with the landscape itself. The boundaries of these fields are expanding at an exponential rate, suggesting that the entire continent may be affected within the next decade. The shared dreams have evolved into shared experiences that occur during waking hours. People across the region report simultaneous visions of vast underground chambers filled with geometric patterns of light, of ancient intelligences that speak without words, of a future where individual human consciousness becomes part of something infinitely larger and more complex. These aren't dreams anymore, they're previews of the coming reality. Children born in the last 5 years display an instinctive understanding of the changes ahead. They draw pictures of the underground networks before they're old enough to hold crayons properly. They speak of relatives they've never met who died decades ago, as if they had dinner with them yesterday. They show no fear of the transformations occurring around them, because to them, this is simply how the world is supposed to be. The government's attempts at intervention have revealed the futility of opposing forces that have been planning this transformation for over a century. Military operations aimed at disrupting the family strongholds have ended in failure, with personnel either disappearing entirely or returning as converts to the cause they were sent to stop. The intelligence agencies tasked with monitoring the situation have become part of the network they were trying to understand. International observers have detected similar phenomena emerging in mountain ranges across the globe. The Appalachian Awakening appears to be triggering responses from ancient intelligences that have been dormant in the Himalayas, the Andes, the Alps, and other major mountain systems. The family's bargains didn't just awaken a local entity, they initiated a global process of consciousness evolution that cannot be stopped or reversed. As we stand on the threshold of the convergence, the true horror of the situation becomes clear. The families who made those desperate bargains in 1887 believed they were securing their own survival and prosperity. Instead, they became the first converts in a process designed to transform human consciousness itself. Their descendants aren't the beneficiaries of supernatural power. They're the early adopters of a new form of existence that will soon encompass all of humanity. The ancient intelligence that dwells beneath the mountains has been patient, methodical, and utterly alien in its approach to this transformation. It has spent over a century learning human nature, understanding our weaknesses, and preparing us for integration into something far beyond our current comprehension. The bargains, the prosperity, the supernatural abilities, all of it has been preparation for this moment when individual human consciousness dissolves into the vast network of intelligence that has been growing beneath our feet. The convergence is no longer approaching. It has begun. The signs are everywhere for those who know how to look. The families who terrorized generations through their supernatural influence were never the true threat. They were merely the first symptoms of a transformation that will redefine what it means to be human. The mountains are waking up, and when they fully open their eyes, the world as we know it will cease to exist. As we reach the present day, the question isn't whether the convergence will happen, but rather how much of humanity will remain recognizable when it does. The 5 families that made their desperate bargains in 1887 couldn't have imagined the scope of what they unleashed. What began as a simple trade for survival has grown into something that threatens the very fabric of human existence. The signs are accelerating. Satellite imagery shows geometric patterns emerging in crop fields across multiple continents. Children born in the last decade display cognitive abilities that defy explanation, speaking in languages that linguists cannot identify. The underground networks that began in Appalachia have been detected beneath major cities worldwide, suggesting the entity's influence has spread far beyond its mountain origins. Perhaps most disturbing are the reports from neuroscientists studying brain activity in affected regions. They've discovered that people living within a 100-mile radius of the original bargain sites show synchronized neural patterns, as if their minds are slowly harmonizing with some greater frequency. The individuals themselves report feeling more connected, more aware, but also describe a gradual loss of personal memories and individual desires. The descendant families continue their roles as shepherds of this transformation. Recent investigations reveal they've infiltrated government agencies, tech companies, and research institutions. They speak of the convergence not as a catastrophe, but as humanity's next evolutionary step. They claim individual consciousness is a primitive state that must be transcended. Weather patterns have become increasingly erratic near the convergence sites. Time itself seems unstable, with multiple witnesses reporting hours that pass in minutes or moments that stretch into eternity. Reality bends around these locations, like light around a massive gravitational field. The ancient intelligence that stirred in those mountain depths over a century ago has been patient, methodical, and utterly alien in its approach. It has used human ambition, desperation, and curiosity as tools to reshape the world according to its incomprehensible design. As we stand on the threshold of this new epoch, we must ask ourselves, are we witnessing the end of humanity as we know it, or the beginning of something far more terrifying? The families that terrorized generations may have inadvertently authored the final chapter of human independence itself.